Prologue, Chapter 3, Part 3 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Armadale by Wilkie Collins. Prologue, Chapter 3, The Wreck of the Timber Ship, Part 3. Read by David Barnes. At the moment when the two men rose to their feet, the door leading into the next room was shaken heavily on the outer side, and a sound like the sound of a fall, striking dull on their ears, silenced them both. Standing nearest to the door, the doctor opened it, passed through, and closed it instantly. Mr. Neal turned his back on the bed, and waited the event in silence. The sound, which had failed to awaken the child, had failed also to attract the father's notice. His own words had taken him far from all that was passing at his deathbed. His helpless body was back on the wreck, and the ghost of the lifeless hand was turning the lock of the cabin door. A bell rang in the next room. Eager voices talked, hurried footsteps moved in it. An interval passed, and the doctor returned. "Was she listening?" whispered Mr. Neal in German. "The women are restoring her," the doctor whispered back. "She has heard it all. In God's name, what are we to do next?" Before it was possible to reply, Mr. Armadale spoke. The doctor's return had roused him to a sense of present things. "Go on," he said, as if nothing had happened. "I refuse to meddle further with your infamous secret," returned Mr. Neal. "You are a murderer on your own confession. If that letter is to be finished, don't ask me to hold the pen for you." "You gave me your promise," was the reply, spoken with the same immovable self-possession. "You must write for me, or break your word." For the moment Mr. Neal was silenced. There the man lay, sheltered from the execration of his fellow creatures, under the shadow of death, beyond the reach of all human condemnation, beyond the dread of all mortal laws, sensitive to nothing but his one last resolution to finish the letter addressed to his son. Mr. Neal drew the doctor aside. "A word with you," he said, in German. "Do you persist in asserting that he may be speechless before we can send to Stuttgart?" "Look at his lips," said the doctor, "and judge for yourself." His lips answered for him. The reading of the narrative had left its mark on them already. A distortion at the corners of his mouth, which had been barely noticeable when Mr. Neal entered the room, was plainly visible now. His slow articulation laboured more and more painfully with every word he uttered. The position was emphatically a terrible one. After a moment more of hesitation, Mr. Neal made a last attempt to withdraw from it. "Now my eyes are open," he said sternly, "do you dare hold me to an engagement which you forced on me blindfold?" "No," answered Mr. Armadale. "I leave you to break your word." The look which accompanied that reply stung the Scotchman's pride to the quick. When he spoke next, he spoke seated in his former place at the table. "No man ever yet said of me that I broke my word," he retorted angrily, "and not even you shall say it of me now. Mind this, if you hold me to my promise, I hold you to my condition. I have reserved my freedom of action, and I warn you I will use it at my own sole discretion as soon as I am released from the sight of you." "Remember he is dying," pleaded the doctor gently. "Take your place, sir," said Mr. Neal, pointing to the empty chair. "What remains to be read I will only read in your hearing. What remains to be written I will only write in your presence. You brought me here. I have a right to insist, and I do insist, on your remaining as a witness to the last." The doctor accepted his position without remonstrance. Mr. Neal returned to the manuscript, and read what remained of it uninterruptedly to the end. "Without a word in my own defence, I have acknowledged my guilt. Without a word in my own defence, I will reveal how the crime was committed. No thought of him was in my mind when I saw his wife insensible on the deck of the timber ship. I did my part in lowering her safely into the boat. Then, and not till then, I felt the thought of him coming back. In the confusion that prevailed while the men of the yacht were forcing the men of the ship to wait their time, I had an opportunity of searching for him unobserved. I stepped back from the bulwark, not knowing whether he was away in the first boat or whether he was still on board. I stepped back and saw him mount the cabin stairs empty-handed, with the water dripping from him. After looking eagerly towards the boat, without noticing me, he saw there was time to spare before the crew were taken off. Once more, he said to himself, and disappeared again, to make a last effort at recovering the jewel-box. The devil at my elbow whispered, "Don't shoot him like a man. Drown him like a dog." He was under water when I bolted the scuttle, but his head rose to the surface before I could close the cabin door. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I locked the door in his face. The next minute I was back among the last men left on deck. The minute after, it was too late to repent. The storm was threatening us with destruction, and the boat's crew were pulling for their lives from the ship. "My son, I have pursued you from my grave with a confession which my love might have spared you. Read on, and you will know why. I will say nothing of my sufferings. I will plead for no mercy to my memory. There is a strange sinking at my heart, a strange trembling in my hand while I write these lines, which warns me to hasten to the end. I left the island without daring to look for the last time at the woman whom I had lost so miserably, whom I had injured so vilely. When I left, the whole weight of the suspicion roused by the manner of Ingleby's death rested on the crew of the French vessel. No motive for the supposed murder could be brought home to any of them, but they were known to be, for the most part, outlawed ruffians capable of any crime, and they were suspected and examined accordingly. It was not till afterwards that I heard by accident of the suspicion shifting round at last to me. The widow alone recognized the vague description given of the strange man who had made one of the yacht's crew, and who had disappeared the day afterwards. The widow alone knew, from that time forth, why her husband had been murdered, and who had done the deed. When she made that discovery, a false report of my death had been previously circulated in the island. Perhaps I was indebted to the report for my immunity from all legal proceedings. Perhaps, no eye but Ingleby's having seen me lock the cabin door, there was not evidence enough to justify an inquiry. Perhaps the widow shrank from the disclosures which must have followed a public charge against me, based on her own bare suspicion of the truth. However it might be, the crime which I had committed unseen has remained a crime unpunished from that time to this. I left Madeira for the West Indies in disguise. The first news that met me when the ship touched at Barbados was the news of my mother's death. I had no heart to return to the old scenes. The prospect of living at home in solitude, with the torment of my own guilty remembrances gnawing at me day and night, was more than I had the courage to confront. Without landing or discovering myself to any one on shore, I went as far as the ship would take me, to the island of Trinidad. At that place I first saw your mother. It was my duty to tell her the truth, and I treacherously kept my secret. It was my duty to spare her the hopeless sacrifice of her freedom and her happiness to such an existence as mine, but I did her the injury of marrying her. If she is alive when you read this, grant her the mercy of still concealing the truth. The one atonement I can make to her is to keep her unsuspected